And I think now is a great time to talk about definitions. In today's society, it is at least somewhat accepted that strong beating, sexual abuse, and things like that are abusive. But when we, you and me, say child abuse or childhood trauma, we are talking not only about beating, sexual abuse, or even yelling. It involves much more than that. Child abuse or abuse in general is a very delicate concept. So, what is your presumably objective definition and understanding of child abuse and childhood trauma?
I'll do my best. I think I've defined it on my website as anything that um, anything that invades or hurts the spirit of a child is child abuse. And so now, what is the spirit of the child? Their essence of who they are, their actual developing self, that boundary around their self, when that gets invaded or hurt or punctured in any way, that's abusing the child, that self of that child. So all those things you described, sexual abuse, I mean, to sexually molest a child, to rape a child, to introduce inappropriate sexuality in some way into a child's life, that of course very clearly abuses the spirit of the child. Anything that harms the body of a child, like some adult doing this to a child, is abusing that child's spirit as well as their body. So it's like underneath the body, the sexuality, is that more fundamental self. And so when that self gets hurt, that is abuse. So also yelling, what does yelling do? Yelling is very disruptive to a child's inner world. When parents yell, when parents fight with each other, when parents yell at their child. So it's a more general definition, and it's a little bit harder to quantify it. That's why I think people in our modern world pretty much like very strictly defined quantifiable things. Like, for instance, to have sex with a child if you are an adult is a very clearly, easily defined thing that everyone can grip onto and say that's abuse. To punch a child in the face when you're an adult, that's very clearly an abuse of this less powerful creature, and it's abuse of that child's body. But when you get into like neglecting a child, not giving them something that they deserve, which is parental love when you're their parent, being inconsistent, or parents emotionally betraying the child. It's like that's much harder to quantify, especially in very specific terms. And I think that it's especially hard for people who don't have a strong connection with their own inner selves, especially in a strong way, to understand what anyone's self even is. So it can sound like a very nebulous thing, and it probably doesn't make sense to most people if they don't have a really strong connection with themselves to go along with my, as you use the word, objective definition of child abuse. But to me, it's still very clear. It's like when that child suffers, who's putting the child in a position to allow the child to suffer? Who has created this child to come into a world where it has to experience suffering? It's like the person who has done that is failing at their responsibility to protect that child from suffering. They're not doing an optimal job of nurturing that child to have a connection with him or herself and to grow. And so that person, to me, is abusing the child. And that's again, the definition can seem to be a little vague to understand it in practical terms. It can also, people could view me as very, very harsh because I see every parent as abusive. It's like, find me a parent who isn't to some degree abusive, meaning a parent who hasn't to some degree hurt the spirit of their child, violated the spirit of their child. And yet that is a definition that I use because I see it as an objective definition. It's just a question of, do other people agree with me? Mostly not, but on the other hand, why would they? Most people don't even realize nearly to what degree they've been abused and to what degree they remain traumatized.
And could you give some examples of more subtle child abuse or trauma? Stuff that is not so visible and clear to average people.
Sure, a child who has two parents who don't really love each other, that's abusive to that child. What kind of role modeling are they presenting? What kind of environment is that child being brought up in when they have two parents who who aren't really loving and respecting each other, that child's growing up in a world where the two primary figures in his or her life are not respecting each other fully and are not fully bonded with the purpose of raising this child properly. And that child picks up all the hurt that's going on. Or another simple one, parents who haven't worked out all their traumas. Those parents are going through life still looking for love, looking for nurturance, looking for other people to rescue them. And inevitably, they're looking for people who are dependent on them to give them that love, and who easier to look to than their own child. So that child, at some subtle level, is picking up the messages that his parent is still traumatized, that is still as a traumatized child, is still a needy child, is still looking for external love to meet his or her internal needs, and is looking to that child to rescue the adult. And that's a violation of that child's spirit, because that child did not come into the world to love the parent. And our world is so screwed up that parents go around saying, oh my God, you've got to have children. You'll never experience love like this until you have a child. That is straight up abuse. And it's abuse of the child, abuse of their spirit, abuse of their purpose on this earth. Because the child has a very clear purpose when he's born or she's born: to learn, to grow, to receive love, and to get love from the people who created him or her. And so when those people don't do that, and don't do it fully and optimally, meaning they're a little bit screwed up in some ways, then they're abusing that child. They're abusing their responsibility. And that child is being traumatized by this. And the reason I say they're being traumatized is because when that child experiences that abuse, doesn't get his or her needs met by the people who are primarily responsible to do it, that child suffers. That child has overwhelming feelings. And those overwhelming feelings are not processable. They're getting in the way of his or her growth. They're getting in the way of his or her knowledge about himself. And so because he can't resolve those feelings, he has to split them off because they're so painful. And when he splits them off, then he's dissociating. And that's the hallmark of trauma. It's just something that's too overwhelming to deal with, too overwhelming to talk about. And when we're talking about children that are pre-verbal, they can't even talk about it. So they're putting it somewhere else, they're getting traumatized, and it gets locked inside of them, and it actually creates the fundamentals of their developing personality. So that's why our world is so screwed up, because so many children have this fundamental part of their personality based on trauma from very early life. And it's not just sexual or physical abuse. And that's why it's so confusing for some people, because they're like, I didn't experience any physical abuse, I didn't experience any sexual abuse, but I still relate to all this trauma stuff. And why is that? I feel a little guilty. Like, my parents were not so bad, my world was pretty good, I didn't get abused in any obvious way. And it's like, what they don't realize is they were actually severely abused. It just didn't conform to traditional, conventional societal definitions of abuse. They actually were severely abused, and they're severely traumatized. They just don't know it. And they also feel guilty because they're not getting any support in the world, because they still need to believe that myth that their parents were awesome parents, when the truth is their parents were actually extremely negligent and abusive and failed pretty miserably. That's the category that I fall into, to varying degrees. I mean, a lot of people could hear me talk about my abuse history and they could say, oh, he's pretty extreme on the abuse history. But if they hear the details from another angle, they could say, wow, I don't even get it. It doesn't sound like he was abused at all. And the reality is like, that I was. It's just that most people don't really have a good, strong sense of what abuse is. And they don't have a strong sense of their own abuse history. They don't know who they are very much on the inside. So they really don't relate to me very well. And they don't actually relate to their own real self very well. And they don't relate to children very well.
Yeah.
And often they don't even know any of this, and which is why they so uncomfortably and blithely go along having children, because they think they're actually going to do a pretty good job at it. And when their child starts flipping out and gets upset and gets angry and has tantrums and breakdowns, they do what everyone else in society pretty much does and says, well, that's just normal. The truth is, it may be actually normal, but it's still abusive, because the norm is so absolutely fucked up.
Yeah, it's sad and painfully common.